The enemy of God's people came out to fight. They sent their best fighter out first. His name was Goliath. He was over 9 feet tall. Goliath said,
"Choose a man to come and fight me. If he wins, we will be your servants. But if I win, you will be our servants."
The men in Saul's army were afraid, but David was at home keeping the sheep. One day, David's father called him.
"Take this bread to your brothers who are fighting the enemy."
So David did, and he got to see Goliath and how everyone was afraid of him.
"I will fight Goliath,"
said David. But Saul said,
"You are only a boy. How can you fight Goliath?"
"God will help me,"
said David. David chose 5 smooth stones from a stream. He took his sling in his hand. David called to Goliath,
"You come to me with a sword and spear, but I come to you in the name of God. This battle is the Lord's."
David put a stone in his sling. He threw the stone at Goliath and hit Goliath right in his forehead, and Goliath fell down. David trusted God. God helped David win.
So we are going to talk about David and Goliath a little bit today. How many of you guys are a little familiar with this story? How many of y'all feel like we could just go through worship another time and get something out of that? You guys were just going today. I don't even need to do anything. We just bring the band back out and sing for a while. I am excited to go through David and Goliath with you, but I feel like every time I get an opportunity to open up a Bible and share the word with you guys, I have to start with some qualifiers because Pastor Charlie is, he likes to be kind of funny, right? So just so we're all on the same page with a couple things. Number one, I do not like hugs. I don't know why that's a thing that he wants to tell everyone. I don't know why. Secondly, if you guys remember this, you may remember, you may not. The first time I ever shared from the Bible with you guys, I talked about sunflowers. And that has followed me everywhere I have went ever since. And it's like the least manly thing that I would be wanting to follow me around. But I'm walking in Lowe's and people are like, "Oh, sunflower guy." I'm like, man. So there are other things that I'm interested in besides sunflowers, believe it or not. But for whatever reason, that has stuck with me and everybody thinks that that's hilarious. So we talk about it all the time. My wife wanted me to wear a shirt with a big sunflower on it, but I wasn't willing to do that this weekend. So I just want to tell you that right out of the gate, so we're all on the same page, before we jump into our story this week, our Bible story of David and Goliath. And I'm glad that some of you are familiar. I hope you guys, Peru, I hope some of you guys are familiar with the story. I hope online, I hope you guys are familiar with David and Goliath a little bit, because we are going to kind of look at this, and I hope that we find some things we're not familiar with in this story, because that's kind of the goal, that we are going to bring more to it than the flannel board Sunday school version of the story, right? That's kind of the idea. So with that, there are some things I want to tell you. When we learn these stories as young people, and I'm sure many of you were raised in a church where you learned these stories as a kid, we often learn these stories in kind of a vacuum, right? The story of David and Goliath, this account happens in 1 Samuel chapter 17. And if you just read 1 Samuel 17, you're going to read about David and Goliath and this encounter, but you are going to miss some things if you don't have the context of some things that happened earlier. So I want to share those things with you. I want to give you just a couple tips that are going to come back a little bit later as we work through this passage that will help you understand things that you might not understand, and maybe you haven't connected the dots before. The first thing is in 1 Samuel 15. Verse 26, it says, "But Samuel said to him, I will not go back with you. You have rejected the word of the Lord, and the Lord has rejected you as king over Israel." Now, if you're a Bible scholar, or you already know this is not news to you, but if you don't know this, Samuel, the guy talking here, is talking to King Saul. Samuel was the last judge of the Israelite people before they had kings. So they kind of helped run the ship. They kind of steered things in the right direction in absence of a king or anything like that, because God initially didn't really want to give them a king. Samuel, as the last judge, also had the responsibility of anointing the first 2 kings of Israel, the first of which was King Saul. This passage in chapter 15 is super important because we learn something very significant about King Saul's situation in this verse. In chapter 15, we find out that God has rejected Saul as king of Israel. God knows it, Saul knows it. This happens before the David and Goliath account, and that's very important, and we'll circle back to that, I promise. But I wanted you to know that. I wanted you to know that this wasn't just me making something up. This is there if we get outside of chapter 17, where the David and Goliath account is. So I wanted you to know that. I also wanted you to know a little bit about the geography of this situation, because when you read this passage, it's kind of weird if you don't understand the geography. Any geography fans? School, you remember that class? Whew, that was a tough one for me for some reason. Not my favorite. But it does teach you some things, and it does teach us a little bit about this account of David and Goliath. See, this battle between David and Goliath happens in a place called the Valley of Elah. Okay, so it is a valley that kind of lands amongst a couple of mountain ranges that separate the coast where the Philistines were at. They were seafaring people, and the Israelites over in Jerusalem and in that area where they occupied that land. And there was this mountain range, and there were these valleys in and amongst these mountain ranges that people used kind of like a highway, right? It was much easier and safer to travel through these valleys to get to one place to the other. So the Philistines were moving toward the Valley of Elah. They were traveling toward the Israelites because they were going to go to try to conquer the Israelite people. And King Saul heard this, so he rallied up the Israelite army to go hit them off at the pass, right? And it just so happens that they find themselves on either side of the Valley of Elah. They're on the mountain ridge on this side, the Philistines are. The Israelites are on the mountain range on this side. They see each other, and kind of this standoff commences, okay? And now neither side wants to go down into the valley and reveal their army and be very visible to the other side of the battle, and then have to work their way up the mountain to attack their enemy. If you know anything about like military encounters and historical military warfare and those kind of things, you understand that an elevated position is preferred, right? It's easier to fight someone who is down below you than someone who is up above you. So neither side really wanted to take that step. Hence, they tried this method that was used sometimes where they're going to send a single warrior for fight, and each side agrees that whoever wins the whole battle. Okay, so that's kind of what's going on here. And the only other thing I want to tell you before we jump into this account of David and Goliath is this. We are going to look at the account of David and Goliath in kind of three sections. We are going to look at the man, the myth, and the legend, because I love that, the man, the myth, the legend. So, and as we do that, we are going to work through this scripture multiple times. Sometimes we're going to repeat verses. Sometimes it might almost seem like we're going out of order. I don't want you to think that I've lost my mind. That's not the case. I'm doing that on purpose. But each time we look at these verses, we're going to look at something specific in the verse that applies to either the man, the myth, or the legend. And we're going to pick out these key things so that when we're done, we can put it all together and learn some things that David knew that we could apply to our lives that would probably help us out. So we are going to start with the man. The man in this story is David. Some of you knew that. Okay, we'll try that again. The man in this story, come on, Peru, I hope you know this. The man in the story is David. We did a lot better that time. The man in the story is David. A lot of us know things about David. Obviously, David becomes king eventually. He had some things that he did really well and some things that maybe he didn't do so well. I was talking with Pastor Charlie as we were kind of planning through this series and planning for this message, and he said, it's kind of funny, David kind of peaked about 17, right? Like after that, it starts to get a little muddy and a little bit murky. He does some things. There's the adultery thing, conspiracy to commit murder thing, there's those kind of things. We're not going to talk about that stuff today. We don't have enough time in one setting to go through all of David's story. But there are some things about David that we need to know in order for this to completely make sense. Some key things we're going to lift out. So we're going to start with a couple verses here in 1 Samuel 17. We're going to start in verse 12, and it says, "Now David was the son of the Ephrathite named Jesse, who was from Bethlehem in Judah. Jesse had 8 sons, and in Saul's time he was very old. David was the youngest. The 3 oldest followed Saul, but David went back and forth from Saul to tend his father's sheep at Bethlehem." So here's what we know. David's father was Jesse. He was the youngest of 8 sons, and he was a shepherd. Why are those things important? For one, we know that Jesse was rather old, and we know that Saul was aware of who Jesse was. So there was some connections there. Another thing that we know is David was the youngest of 8 sons, which meant falling in line and doing the things that your big brothers and your dad make you do sometimes can probably be a little tough, and you get duties that you might not want. Hence, David was the shepherd of the flock, right? So David was a shepherd. And then the last piece of this that I think is important in that verse, it said, David's oldest 3 brothers were already under Saul. They were already serving King Saul. They were actually in the military already. They were in the army, and they were out at the battlefield. at the Valley of Elah. But David, who also was working for Saul, still was going back and forth, right? So he's a little younger, this, that, and the other. He's helping King Saul. He actually kind of starts as a musician and does some things there. But at times, he's still going back to care for the sheep. So he is still actively a shepherd, and that's very important as we move forward, okay? And there's one other thing here that I want to read to you, and this happened before the David and Goliath account, but it's a big deal. And I want to read this to you out of 1 Samuel 16, and it says this. It says, "And he sent and brought him. Now he was ruddy and had beautiful eyes and was handsome, and the Lord said, 'Arise, anoint him, for this is he.'" Now, all by itself, that passage from 1 Samuel chapter 16 might not mean much, but with a little context, it's very important to this story. This is the moment where Samuel, who had already told Saul that the Lord had rejected him, anointed David as the next king of Israel. And David knew it. So there are two things we've learned here that apply to this story in big ways. One, Saul is no longer favored in the eyes of God. He's been rejected as the king of Israel, and David has been anointed as the next king of Israel. And Saul knows it, and David knows it. And that's a big factor in this story, so I wanted to share that with you. Those are the things that we needed to know about the man so that we could keep moving and we could move on to the myth. So the myth is a little harder to put your finger on. The man, being David, makes sense. The myth is a little different. When we talk about the myth, we are going to talk about Goliath. And I want to tell you something right out of the gate. I want you to understand something I am not saying, okay? I am not saying that Goliath, the giant, was a myth. Goliath? I don't even know what that was. Goliath was a giant. He was real. He was just as real as any one of us. If it's in the Bible, it is accurate and perfect and correct. So I am not contradicting that. Very clear. We all on the same page? Nobody needs to leave here and be like, man, Pastor Charlie wasn't on the platform this weekend. Josh is making stuff up. I don't know what's going on with that guy. That is not what I'm saying. What I am saying is there are some myths in the way we perceive Goliath. And we're going to talk about that. We're going to lift some things out of this scripture that help explain that a little bit. So we are going to start with the myth. We're going to start in 1 Samuel chapter 17, verse 4, and it says, "A champion named Goliath, who was from Gath, came out of the Philistine camp. His height was 6 cubits and a span." Now, Google, best friend. This calculates out to about 9'6". This is a tall dude. You know what I'm saying? Tallest guy in here probably goes what? 6'4", 6'5"? Anybody? A couple of you? Anybody beating that? I'm 5'11" in the right pair of shoes, you know what I'm saying? Like, I get it. So 9'6" is a pretty tall guy, okay? So I will tell you this, and I want to tell you this just for clarity and full transparency. If you hop online and do any research into this after today, because you're just so compelled to learn more, okay? That's my heart, that you're so compelled to learn more. You might see something that could be a little confusing, and I just like you to know this because you're going to run into it. The Dead Sea Scrolls, you guys familiar with the Dead Sea Scrolls a little bit? They were copies of the Old Testament scriptures found in the Qumran caves. As they poured through those, there's copies and copies where they transcribed, so people had copies of this. Some of those said that Goliath was only 4 cubits and a span. Okay, and that happens sometimes as you're transcribing things and you're thinking, man, is this actually right? And maybe you take some liberties that you should or shouldn't have taken. It doesn't matter. I would tell you this, though. 4 cubits and a span is still 6'8", okay? That is not a small guy by any stretch of the imagination. Still tops in the room based on what, unless people didn't raise their hands, right? So 6'8" is still really tall, especially when you put it in this perspective. The average height of a person in that region of the world at that time was 5'3". All right? So, I mean, I'm feeling pretty good in that scenario. Every inch of my 5'11" is like, that's right. So even if he was only 6'8", which I don't think is true, right? I think he was around 9'6". But even if he was 6'8", he still looked really good coming off the bus if you're getting ready to play a football game, right? Like you see that guy and you're like, all right, I'm tapping out. Like all of a sudden my hamstring is tight, you know? So he was clearly a really, really big man in any sense of the word. I want to go through a couple more verses with you about some things I want to lift out about this myth about Goliath, okay? It says, then he, the he here is David, then he took his staff in his hand, chose 5 smooth stones from the stream, put them in the pouch of his shepherd's bag, and with his sling in his hand, he approached the Philistine. You're like, what does this have to do with Goliath? Nothing yet, but we're going to keep reading the next verses, and it'll make sense. Meanwhile, the Philistine, with his shield bearer in front of him, kept coming closer to David. He looked David over, and he saw that he was little more than a boy, glowing with health and handsome, and he despised him. He said to David, am I a dog that you come at me with sticks? And the Philistine cursed David by his gods. Come here, he said, and I'll give your flesh to the birds and the wild animals. Now, some things here. First of all, I don't know if you've noticed this, but this is in 2 consecutive chapters that the Bible tells us David is incredibly handsome. I don't know why that's important. Best I can figure, ladies, if you're single, try to find somebody in that genealogy, right? You're trying to get the David genes. I don't know. I'm not really sure why that's important, but I find it interesting that we're told that not just once, we are told that twice. Not anything to do with the myth, but interesting. But the things that are about the myth that I want to highlight there, Goliath had a shield bearer in front of him. A shield bearer is a guy who would lead a warrior around and carry his shield. That's kind of weird, right? This guy's 9 foot tall. He doesn't need 5'11" Josh carrying his shield around. He's bigger than anybody out there. Probably doesn't even need a shield. So what's going on with that? It's interesting, right? Another thing I want you to see there. Goliath sees David coming at him, and he's like, why are you coming after me with these sticks? Am I just a dog? Whatever. But he says sticks, plural. And in the previous verse, in verse 40, we know that David had a single staff in his hand. Like, what is the deal with that? Why sticks? And then the third thing that's there is that Goliath calls to David, and he says, come here. Come to me. Now listen, brother, you are 9'6". I do not want to mix it up with you. I am trying to keep my distance. You know what I'm saying? So why is Goliath doing these things, okay? And there's a lot of different ideas out there and about Goliath and exactly what he was and who he was and all this kind of stuff. And I was talking with Pastor Charlie, and we were kind of kicking it around. And this is one of those things that's it's kind of frustrating because we won't have all the answers on this side of heaven. You know what I mean? We won't ever know for sure. I know a few weeks ago, Pastor Charlie talked about the Nephilim, if you remember that. And he mentioned that, this is one of the possible scenarios and connections to Goliath that we're talking about today. But we're just not quite sure. And there's another explanation that's kind of come up a little more recently. Some medical experts and some biblical historians, really smart people, thankful for smart people, they have picked up on some clues in this passage that might explain a little bit about Goliath. There is a disease that is called acromegaly. Okay? Acromegaly is a disease of the pituitary gland that does some very specific, interesting things to people. The first thing it does is it causes your body to produce large amounts of human growth hormone, HGH. Okay? The tallest modern man on record died when he was still growing, and he was 8'11" tall, and he suffered from acromegaly. Okay? Another thing that this disease does is it often causes severe nearsightedness, which would mean you can see here, but you can't see there, right? Which would speak to why he needs a shield bearer. The guy's not out there to protect him. The guy is out there to guide him, right? He can't see where he's actually headed in the distance. And another thing that often accompanies, almost always accompanies acromegaly, did so good. Acromegaly is double vision. People suffer from double vision. So when he sees David coming toward him with a staff in his hand, he doesn't know if that's one staff or 2 or 3 or 4. Hence why he's asking why you're coming at me with sticks. Okay? So this is a plausible explanation, scientifically supported explanation of exactly what's going on with Goliath and how he got his massive size and strength. But talking about the myth of Goliath, it also helps us understand that while Goliath was big and strong and was a champion of the Philistine people, he was not perfect, right? He was not without some faults. And I think we have this myth about Goliath in our heads that he was this unconquerable giant guy that we couldn't possibly mix it up with and have any success at all, okay? And this is kind of the way I see it. We have a view of Goliath that he was like a superhero, right? Maybe I should say supervillain. That he was this supervillain, that he was beyond anybody's ability to have, to even confront him and have any success at all. And that's not really true. Yeah, he had his strengths, but he certainly had his weaknesses. What Goliath did was put King Saul in a bind. And I was trying to figure out, how can I explain this bind that King Saul is in here? And I was trying to think of a way to communicate that would make some sense. And I thought of a situation that I spent some time in. I was a youth pastor, a student pastor for 11 years. I don't know if you guys know that or not, but we're always teaching the Bible and doing those things. But also a big part of student ministry is building relationships with students, which looks a lot of different ways, right? And you do trips and you do camps and you do all these kind of things. And there was a situation where we took a group of students and adults to an amusement park. Turns out when we planned the trip, we couldn't control the weather. It was cold and kind of rainy, not a great day to be at an amusement park, right? But you're going to make the best of it. So we're at this amusement park, we're hanging out, we're trying to have fun, we're trying to make fun when we need to. And myself, a good buddy of mine named Paul, and my cousin named Nate, who was with us, and our wives, we were cutting from point A in the amusement park to point B in the amusement park, and we cut through the area that I call the pay-to-play area. You know what I mean? This is the part where they have all the carnival games that you pay large amounts of money for very small prizes. You with me? Okay? And there was no one here. Like, the only people using this space were like to cross through, just like us. And we're like, man, this is a real bummer for all these workers. They're like hanging out. There's nobody here. There's nothing for them to do. Like, it was like the quietest part of amusement park I've ever been in. So we decided we're going to mix it up a little bit. So we go up to this game. It is named incredibly clever. It's called quarter toss. And you toss a quarter. And you toss these quarters and you try to land them on these little mirrors that are about 4 inches in diameter that's on this table out in the middle. And there's different pedestals of different heights with all these mirrors. And we're just trying to, have a little fun. So we're tossing these quarters. And of course, every time we miss, because it's kind of set up for you to not be super successful, every time we missed, we're like, oh, like we're like being stupid, right? Just trying to have some fun. We start talking with the worker. He starts telling us kind of about how they run the game, and they move these things around, and sometimes they can make it a little easier, and they can make it a little harder, and they can do this and that, but they don't like to move these things while there are people, at the game, because they don't want somebody to think that they're cheating or that it's rigged or anything like that, right? Make sense? As we're talking, as we're throwing quarters and just being stupid, trying to have a good time, he's moving these things around a little bit and kind of teaching us this stuff. And then it happens. Okay, he sets us up for some serious success. He managed to work 3 of these pedestals in a row. So the one closest to us was the tallest. Immediately behind it was another one that was a little lower. Immediately behind that was one that was a little lower. And we could toss our quarter, and it would kind of slide off of there, and it would land on the back one, and it would stay. And inside of 2 or 3 minutes, all 3, myself, Paul, and Nate, we all won the prize, which was a giant, like 4 to 5 foot tall neon gorilla. Okay? I don't know why. They were green, pink, and blue. I don't know why that was the prize. But we just had a riot, right? And we were being loud and crazy and carrying on while we won these gorillas. And as we walked away, we turned and we kind of looked and we realized in all of our shenanigans, for lack of better description, a whole bunch of people had found their way to this carnival game. They wanted to see what the commotion was about, okay? They wanted to see why these idiots, I'm sure my wife was terrified. She's like, these guys are idiots. What are they doing? But people wanted to see what was happening. And as we walked away, we realized we'd kind of put that worker in a bind. He had already told us that they don't like to move them when the pedestals around when there's a bunch of people there, but he had set these pedestals up in a way that it was very easy to win. Now he couldn't move them. He had a whole crowd of people around his game. And I kid you not, over the rest of the afternoon, we probably saw 30 gorillas walking around that place. It was the biggest gorilla giveaway day in the history of Michigan Adventure. I don't know. I hope the guy didn't lose his job. Feeling kind of bad still about that. But that is what Goliath did to King Saul. He came out into the valley of Elah. He made a big show. He called out the Israelites. He called out God, and he made a scene. He drew a bunch of attention to himself and put King Saul in a bind. King Saul had a decision to make. He could send somebody out there to fight Goliath, This 9-foot dude who probably would win. And if he did that, the Israelites would then become the Philistine subject. Or he could try to come up with a different plan or a different strategy, or he could hold off until it becomes a full-fledged battle. But here's the deal. The Philistine army was they estimate about 30,000 people. The best estimates for the Israelite army was about 10,000 people. So even if it's a full-fledged battle with everybody participating, it doesn't really look good for the Israelites. And Goliath making a scene and putting all this pressure on King Saul and the Israelites, all he really did, right, was run his mouth and put somebody in a pickle. That's all Goliath really did. It was a good pickle. He had Saul in a pretty tough spot. There's no doubt about it. But, again, not a super villain, unconquerable threat. Just a smart, big, strong guy who had some success in face-to-face battles. So I just want to keep that in perspective as we move through this, because Goliath, while he was a big deal, he wasn't invincible. Okay? We're going to move on to the next section of this passage. We're going to look at the legend. Okay? The legend in the story is kind of the action scene. Okay? This is where things start to happen. This is where David gets involved and he makes an impact in this story. And I want to read this to you. This is from 1 Samuel 17, and we're going to start in verse 34. And this is what it says. It says, "But David said to Saul, 'Your servant used to keep sheep for his father, and when there came a lion or a bear and took a lamb from the flock, I went after him, and I struck him and delivered it out of his mouth. And if he rose against me, I caught him by his beard, I struck him, I killed him. Your servant has struck down both lions and bears, and this uncircumcised Philistine shall be like one of them, for he has defied the armies of the living God.' And David said, 'The Lord who delivered me from the paw of the lion and from the paw of the bear will deliver me from the hand of the Philistine.' And Saul said to David, 'Go, and the Lord be with you.'" This is legend, okay? What we didn't read, David had previously, just immediately before this, he had went to Saul. He's like, "Saul, why is this dude running his mouth about us and God? Why aren't somebody doing something about it? I'm going to go fight this dude." And Saul says, "Man, you're too young. You're barely older than a boy. You're not big enough. He's a champion. He's a warrior." And David goes off and he gives his legendary speech, followed by the mic drop, in which Saul says, "Dude, you got this." Now, King Saul is not me or you, right? Not just a normal person. Like if David comes up to me and we're looking at Goliath and David's like, "Hey, Josh, man, somebody's got to do something about this. I'm going to go fight this guy." I'm like, "Bro, you have at it. That means I don't have to. Good luck." Like, that's great for me, right? That's a win for me. But for King Saul, when he makes that decision, he's making a decision with the fate of the entire Israelite community on his back. Okay? So for David to throw this speech down and throw this out there, and King Saul to buy in, the passion and the conviction in David's voice had to be overpowering, right? He is going to go after it. He is going to get it. And King Saul believes him and says, "Man, you do you. You make this happen." But then something really interesting happens. And I want you to see this verse in 1 Samuel 17, these two verses here. It says, "Then Saul dressed David in his own tunic. He put a coat of armor on him and a bronze helmet on his head. David fastened on his sword over the tunic and tried walking around because he wasn't used to them. And he said, 'I cannot go in these because I am not used to them.' So he took them off." This is incredibly interesting to me. Saul buys in to David's plan to fight Goliath, and he says, "I am going to equip you, David, with the things you need to go and defeat Goliath." Saul is going to give him the tools that he needs to make him successful, but it doesn't work. And you know why it doesn't work? Saul cannot equip David for something God has already equipped him for. Saul was already rejected by God as the king of Israel. All right? Saul knew it. It was already done. But he tried to take it upon himself to equip David, the people around him, to go and win the battle the way that King Saul saw fit. And David did not need that. God had already equipped David to win the battle the way God saw fit. And this is what we do all the time, guys. We listen to all the voices around us and we forget that God has already equipped us to do the work that God planned for us to do. if you know it here, it doesn't matter what your brother or your cousin or your friend or your spouse, you should listen to your spouse, guys. It does not matter. It does not matter because God has already given you the tools that you need to do it. And I think that is huge. And it doesn't make sense unless you understand that Saul had already been rejected by God. I think this is, when I read this passage, I don't even know how many times, this screamed at me because I think this happens way too much. I think I'm guilty of doing this sometimes. I'm sure I have tried to equip people for things that God has already prepared them for. I'm an idiot sometimes. I get it. We have to be aware of this. I think that is so powerful. I want to keep moving through this because we don't have time. I could probably spend another 10 minutes on this passage, but I can't. But as we go on through the story, it says this. This should look familiar to you. Then he took his staff in his hand, chose 5 smooth stones from the stream, put them in the pouch of his shepherd's bag, and with his sling in his hand, approached the Philistine. Now, this was very interesting to me because he didn't want the armor. He didn't want the sword. He couldn't use those things. He wanted his sling. And I wanted to know what a shepherd's sling was. So I searched high and low to find a shepherd's sling, because it's not a slingshot, obviously. I don't want to tell you where I got this because it was very hard to find, Amazon. I don't want to tell you that, how much I paid for this, because you guys would think that there's no way you should spend, $10 for this. But I just kind of wanted to know about this weapon that David chose over a sword, because I'm thinking, I'm fighting this dude, I need everything I can get, right? David wants his sling. And what this is it turns out there's a little loop you put on your finger. In a little bit, you're going to find out why that's so important. And you put the rock in there, and you spin this around, and you let the other side go, and this rock will go hurling at a tremendous amount of speed toward a target, hopefully in the direction you intend. So I'm like, well, how much damage could you really do with one of these things, right? So I start to just research, right? I start to read. There's really smart people out there. And today in our world, we have come up with this idea, this number of that we call momentum. And it's a calculation based on the speed of a projectile, the weight and the surface area of contact of a projectile. And we call this momentum. And if you're familiar with firearms, you might know this. And here's what an average guy with this type of sling and a stone can create: a momentum figure of 2.8. You're like, great. Cool. But here's the cool part. The momentum figure of a .45 caliber bullet shot from a handgun is 2.85. Okay? So when I learned that, I did what every good, well-mannered man would do. I called my buddies and I said, let's mix this up, guys. I got this sling. Let's see what kind of damage we can do. And I want to show you a video clip where we took nowhere near enough safety measures. Ladies, this is why you live longer than all of us men. But I want to show you our experience with this shepherd's sling. So why don't you guys take a look at this quick video. So here's what we learned. Number one, we are not very good with the shepherd's sling. Number two, we absolutely could have killed someone and should have did some things to be a little safer. Number three, a shepherd's sling will throw a stone at a shockingly alarming rate. It is incredibly fast, and I was shocked. It was incredibly impressive to see how far we could throw these stones with this thing and how fast they moved. Now, obviously, you need to practice more than we did. We were 3 clowns out in a field for, half hour messing around. If you were skilled with this sling, it would be a devastating weapon. And this is what I learned. Okay, this is what I learned from this. David brought a gun to a knife fight. Okay? David could have went and took the tunic and the armor and the sword and went and faced Goliath on his terms. But David said, no way. God has equipped me with these tools, and it's way better for the task at hand. Why would I possibly try to use something other than what God has equipped me with? And he took a gun to a knife fight. Now, I want to keep moving through this story. We're kind of winding down through the story here. And it says this in verses 48 and 49. It says, as the Philistine moved closer to attack him, David ran quickly toward the battle line to meet him. Reaching into his bag and taking out a stone, he slung it and struck the Philistine on the forehead. The stone sank into his forehead, and he fell face down on the ground. And with that, David defeated Goliath, right? But some other things happened that I think are really interesting. In this 1 Samuel 17, verse 50, it says, so David prevailed over the Philistine with a sling and with a stone, and he struck the Philistine and killed him. There was no sword in the hand of David. And when I read that, I think it's so significant. I think this conversation that David constantly had the sling and the stone and not the sword or the spear, it's got a lot to do with exactly what I was talking about, with the fact that God had equipped him with the right tools. Saul was not equipping him with the right tools, right? Such a big deal in this story. There is another verse, and this is kind of the last thing that I want to lift out of this story today, but I really want you to see this. I want you to see this highlighted in yellow here in verse 52. It says, then the men of Israel and Judah surged forward with a shout and pursued the Philistines to the entrance of Gath and blah, 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 and on and on and on. Now, this is significant because this is the same group of men, outnumbered maybe 3-1, maybe more, who were terrified. Some people even suggest some of them were deserting King Saul because they were afraid of Goliath. And with David taking one act that he knew God had prepared him for, and he knew God would provide and support him in, changed the mentality of the entire Israelite army. Okay? David had something going on that the Israelites didn't understand, that King Saul didn't understand. David had some things going on that we need to understand. Okay? There are 5 things that we're going to run through, and I say run. We're going to move through these fast, but I assure you, if you can lift these lessons out of the story of David and Goliath, it will have a huge impact on your day-to-day life, your community, the people around you, because it's all about having the same view that David had. So we're going to move through these. The first one, here we go. 1, we need to have a different perspective. The Israelites saw an obstacle. David saw an opportunity. David wasn't concerned. He didn't think it was something he couldn't get around. It was an opportunity for him to serve God and serve the Israelite people. It didn't matter. It was not an obstacle. For him, it was nothing but a speed bump. It was not a brick wall. It was not something he couldn't get through. It was just another thing he was going to do in his day-to-day life. He looked at it different. His perspective was different. Number 2, we need to have a different method. They used swords and armor. David used a sling and a stone. This is a big deal. Have you ever maybe if you've ever worked on a car, this might make sense to you. Sometimes you're trying to take the bolt on like the back part of the engine down in there. You're trying to reach something, right? And you're using every tool. If you've ever, and this is maybe just speaking to my mechanic's ability here a little bit, but maybe like you've used like the 14 extensions to try to get down in there to that one bolt, and you're beating your head against the wall. When if you just climb under the car, you could reach it with the proper tool and do it the right way in the first place, right? That's really what this comes down to. David knew the right way to approach Goliath, and it wasn't the same method that everybody assumed you had to use. Number 3, we need to have a different motive. The Israelites heard Goliath's threat. David heard nothing but God's promises, right? They heard Goliath running their mouth, and they were terrified. The only thing that mattered to David was the promises that God gave him. Right? That was the only thing he heard, and that was the thing that he acted on. And I think so many times we hear the threats, we hear the negative, we hear the struggles of the world, and we forget the promises that God's already made to us. And if we would act on the promises God made to us, our lives would look a lot different. But instead, just like the Israelites, we act out of fear. Number 4, here we go. We need to have a different priority. They wanted to live for themselves. David was willing to live, or maybe I should say David was willing to die for God. See, it didn't matter because David's priorities were on God. They were God's priorities. They weren't his priorities. The Israelites were about self-preservation. They did not want to go and fight Goliath. They did not want to be subject to the Philistines. But David wasn't worried about any of that. He was going to do what God made him to do in the first place. And this is the last one, and I think this is a big one. We need to have a different attitude. They saw Goliath as a giant threat they couldn't beat. David saw Goliath as a giant target he couldn't miss. Right? He's like, listen, I've seen lions, I've seen bears, I've taken care of them. They are smaller targets for me. This is easy. I'm not worried about this at all. But all the Israelites could do was be afraid of this giant man. It's all about your attitude. There are these 5 things, guys, these 5 things. If you walk out of here today with a different perspective, a different method, a different motive, a different priority, and a different attitude, and you shift those and you make them of God instead of man, instead of the world, your lives will be different starting right now. At lunch today, in your house this afternoon, at your job tomorrow. If you approach your perspectives, methods, motives, priorities, and attitudes in the way God calls you to live, your life will be better and you'll be able to make a kingdom impact you never knew you had the power to make. With a sling and a stone, David changed the fate of the whole Israelite army because he focused on God instead of what everyone else was telling him. That's my prayer for you today, that we would focus on the things of God and not the things of man. I'd love to pray for you. Father God, we just ask that your word, Lord, would change our lives. When we open up your scriptures and we read them, Lord, that you would reveal things to us that we didn't know were there before. That you would reveal things to us that would change our lives so that we could live the life you made for us, God. So that we could live a life reaching other people. So that we could live a life making an impact in this world that's a reflection of you, God. We come here, we gather in your name to learn and to worship, but ultimately the goal is that we can become tools to bring people to the feet of Jesus, God. Let us have that attitude, God. Let us have your ways in our hearts instead of the ways of the world so that we can make an impact and bring people to your kingdom, Father. We thank you so much for your word. We thank you for all the ways that you bless us, God. And most importantly, we thank you for Jesus, that he would come and that he would do the things that he did, that he would die and rise for us so we could be reconciled to you, Lord. It's in his name we pray. All God's people said, amen.